I'm Lorraine Maddox, 68 years old, and the day I walked up to my own front porch and found a stranger's keyhole staring back at me was the day I learned how quietly a life can be stolen. The paint on the door was still chipped, the way I'd always meant to fix, and the same hairline crack ran under the welcome mat, but the welcome was gone. Just days earlier, my son Bryce had been pulled from the water after a boating accident and was lying in the ICU. While machines kept him breathing, his wife Autumn was changing more than locks. By the time I realized what she'd done, pieces of my home, my place, and my name had already been carried away. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to push you out. I grew up in a small coastal town in Oregon, raised by parents who believed in hard work, fairness, and never turning your back on family. I carried those lessons into adulthood, into my marriage to Robert, and later into my years raising Bryce. As a nurse, I had spent decades tending to strangers with patience and care, and I poured the same devotion into my only child. After Robert passed, the house became more than walls and windows. It was our anchor, a place where Sunday dinners and quiet mornings bound us together. Bryce and I shared easy rhythms walks by the marina, taste testing his latest chili recipes, and unplanned hugs in the hallway. Even when life changed, those moments reminded me who we were. When Bryce met Autumn, I wanted to believe we could expand that circle. I offered them the master bedroom without being asked. I gave up my quiet Sunday spot by the kitchen window so she could make her lattes in peace. I even bit my tongue when she rearranged the mantel and pushed Robert's photo to the corner. I told myself this was what blending families looked like, small sacrifices for a bigger whole. Over time, Bryce's visits to the marina with me grew fewer, but they never stopped completely, not until the night of his accident. The call came just after 2 a.m. A calm voice from the hospital told me Bryce was stable but unconscious. I drove there in the dark coat, buttoned against the coastal wind, and found Autumn already at his side. She took my hand, said he needed both of us, and for a moment I believed her. But by the next morning, she told me I couldn't be in the ICU hospital policy, she said, and promised she'd update me. I had been a nurse long enough to know when someone was lying. Still, I went home to shower, expecting to return quickly. Instead, I stood on my own porch, key in hand, realizing it no longer fit. No note on the door, no warning, just a single envelope in the mailbox containing a hotel keycard and 4 words: "This is for now." The neighbor's dog barked, as if I didn't belong there. My name was on the mortgage. I had helped pay the down payment. But that afternoon, the house felt as far away as Bryce himself. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself she was scared and overwhelmed, that once Bryce woke up, he'd set things right. But as I sat on the motel bed, staring at a bottle of lotion labeled renewal, I knew something larger was shifting, and not in my favor. I didn't know then just how much Autumn had already taken, or how far she was willing to go to make sure I never stepped inside that house again. When I woke the next morning in the motel, the first thing I saw was the pale light pushing through the thin curtains. It had the washed-out look of a coastal morning, the kind that never quite turns bright. My phone sat on the nightstand, silent. There were no updates from the hospital, no word from Bryce, and certainly nothing from Autumn. The quiet felt heavy. I got dressed without rushing, pulled on my coat, and drove straight to the hospital, hoping that being in the building might give me some sense of connection. The nurse at the desk recognized my name, but looked uneasy. She clicked through a few screens before glancing back at me. "He's stable," she said in a low voice. "No changes." Then she added something else even softer. Bryce had been moved to private status family only. In their records, I didn't qualify. I thanked her anyway and walked out, my steps echoing in the corridor. The library downtown was quiet, the kind of place where no one asked questions. I logged into one of the public computers and printed what I could: the deed to the house showing my co-ownership, an older copy of the insurance policy where my name had once been listed as a co-beneficiary. It was dated over a year ago. I needed to know when that changed and who had signed off on it. As I was leaving, I noticed a flyer on the community bulletin board. In one corner, there was a notice about free legal advice for seniors offered on Wednesday afternoons at the First Street Church. It was Monday. I took the flyer anyway and slipped it into my coat pocket. That night, in the motel room, I made a list. Not groceries or bills, just the things that were missing: my house key, my seat at Bryce's bedside, my name on the insurance, my place in the family. By Wednesday, I found myself sitting at a folding table inside the church basement, explaining my situation to a man in a corduroy jacket. He listened without interrupting, jotting the occasional note on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he didn't offer advice right away. Instead, he handed me a business card. "Call this woman," he said. "She might be able to help you quietly." The card read, "Trina Delgado, estate attorney." I didn't call right away. I walked down toward the marina first, letting the wind work its way into my coat. The boats rocked in their slips ropes, creaking against metal. Bryce used to bring me here on quiet Sundays, long before things became complicated. Later that afternoon, I dialed the number. The voice on the other end was crisp, but calm. "When can you come in?" she asked. I told her whenever. She said, "Now." Her office was in an older brick building near the harbor. Inside, the shelves were full but slightly tilted, a sign of use rather than decoration. Trina sat behind a desk with a legal pad and a cup of tea that smelled faintly of citrus. I slid my papers across the desk, and she studied each one in silence. When she finally looked up, her question was direct. "When did your name disappear from the beneficiary line?" I told her I didn't know. I'd only seen the withdrawal alert 2 nights earlier. She tapped her pen twice. "Let's find out who signed what and when." Then she asked if I had any samples of Bryce's handwriting cards, forms, anything with his signature. I told her there were boxes of them at the house. She nodded once. "Then our first step is getting you back inside legally, even if it's just to retrieve those." She explained something called contested occupancy, because my name was still on certain ownership records. We could use that to request access. 2 days later, I was standing on my front porch again, this time with Trina at my side and a sheriff's deputy behind us. Autumn opened the door wearing yoga pants and a towel draped around her shoulders. Her eyes narrowed at the envelope in the deputy's hand. 50 minutes, he told her. She stepped aside without speaking. I walked in and headed straight for the hallway closet. The air smelled of lemon cleaner and lavender, a little too staged. The box was right where I remembered, full of old documents and school mementos. I took the whole thing. As I turned to leave, I saw the photo wall. My face had been cut out of the pictures, a square of beige paper where I used to be. Back at Trina's office, we went through the contents of the box. She compared Bryce's real signatures to the one on the insurance change form. The difference was obvious. "Forgery," she said. That same day, she called the insurance company. By evening, the payout had been frozen pending investigation. The next morning, Trina had more news. She had found that the house had been transferred into a trust using a medical power of attorney 1 that had expired the week before the accident. "She wasn't even careful," Trina said, circling the dates on the document. That gave us grounds to challenge the trust itself. For now, Trina advised me to stay quiet and let Autumn believe I was stalled. I agreed. That afternoon, I walked along the pier to the last bench near the railing. Bryce used to sit there when he needed to think, his eyes on the water. The tide moved gently below, but my thoughts were steady. A few days later, I spotted Autumn leaving a cafe near the courthouse with 2 women I didn't recognize, both carrying shopping bags. She looked rested, her hair styled, her boots new. I stayed where I was, unseen, and watched. That night, I made another list, this one titled Things She Didn't Expect. At the top, the old notarized deed from 2006, copies of Bryce's early medical directives, neighbors who still owed me favors, and at the bottom, the name Trina Delgado. On Friday, Trina filed the petition to contest the trust. She walked it through the courthouse herself. She told me we would have a hearing in 10 business days. I thought I could wait that long, but on Sunday, a courier knocked on my motel door with a padded envelope. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Autumn's attorney, accusing me of harassment, defamation, and unlawful entry. It warned of legal action if I contacted Bryce or interfered with the trust. I took it straight to Trina. She read it paced once across her office and said, "This is meant to intimidate you. It's all bark, no teeth." I believed her, but the letter told me one thing for sure: Autumn was getting nervous. And that meant she was capable of anything in the days ahead. Autumn's letter stayed on the corner of Trina's desk, unopened after that first read. She didn't waste time arguing over it. Instead, she pulled out a notepad and began outlining the steps we needed before the hearing. "We'll need more than signatures," she said, tapping her pen. "Paperwork tells one story. Patterns tell another." She explained that every action Autumn had taken left traces, dates, logins, witnesses. If we could tie those together, it would build a clearer picture for the judge. The first piece came sooner than expected. Trina received confirmation that the insurance company had frozen the payout. An investigator was assigned, and they requested all available handwriting samples for comparison. I brought in the cards from Bryce's school years, the lease renewal he signed with me 5 years ago, and even a birthday card from last year. Side by side, the forged signature on the change form looked clumsy. The loops were wrong, the pressure uneven. By the end of that meeting, Trina had filed a formal request for the bank's surveillance footage from the day the insurance paperwork was notarized. She also sent inquiries to the real estate office and the county clerk's office for the trust transfer records. If she was alone for any of these, Trina said it strengthens our claim. I left her office with a copy of the motions. She had filed the papers neatly clipped together in a folder. The motel room felt smaller that night. I set the folder on the table and opened my notebook. Instead of listing what was missing, I wrote down each step Trina had taken line by line so I could see the path forming. It wasn't fast, but it was forward. 2 mornings later, Trina called before 8. "The bank footage is in," she said. Her voice had that steady edge she got when something was important. "Come by this afternoon." When I arrived, she had the video paused on her laptop. The timestamp matched the day and time on the notarized form. On screen, Autumn walked in, a lone folder in hand. She sat across from the notary, slid papers forward, and signed. Bryce never appeared in the frame. Trina didn't press play again. She didn't need to. "This goes in with the rest," she said. "It's enough for an emergency motion to freeze the trust transactions as well." She typed as she spoke, her fingers quick but controlled. The motion was filed before I left the building. 2 days later, the court granted the freeze. It didn't touch every source of money Autumn had, but it locked down the trust, the house, and the insurance payout until the hearing. That afternoon, the motel manager knocked on my door with a printed email. My room had been paid from an account in Autumn's name, and the payment had been stopped. I had until the next morning to check out. Trina found me another room by nightfall. It was smaller, smelled faintly of damp carpet, but it had a working lock and a clean bed. "This is her. Trying to force your hand," Trina said over the phone. I unpacked slowly, folding each piece of clothing into the dresser, as if the order might help keep my thoughts clear. Later that week, Trina received another lead: a discrepancy in the trust paperwork. The medical power of attorney Autumn had used was no longer valid at the time she filed it. It expired the week before Bryce's accident, she said, sliding the document across her desk. The date was clear in black ink. "This gives us grounds to challenge the trust entirely." We spent the next day collecting additional documents. I contacted the neighbors across the street, the ones who had once borrowed my ladder and never returned it. They remembered seeing movers arrive the afternoon after Bryce's accident. No moving truck, just 2 cars loaded with boxes. They also remembered Autumn giving instructions from the porch, clipboard in hand. Trina added their statements to the file. "It shows intent," she explained. She wasn't reacting in the moment, she had a plan. The file was getting thicker, each page a piece of a puzzle that was starting to make sense. On Friday, the investigator from the insurance company called to confirm they were reviewing the forgery claim. He asked for a short statement about the events leading up to the change. I kept it to the facts when I last saw the policy, when I learned my name was removed, and the timeline of Bryce's hospitalization. That weekend, I kept to the motel, avoiding any place where Autumn might see me. Trina had been clear, let her think I was waiting quietly. In truth, the work was moving faster now. Documents were in motion, statements were being gathered, and the freeze was holding. Sunday night, as I was making tea, I saw Autumn's name light up my phone. It was the first call from her since Bryce's accident. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, her voice was smooth but tight. "We need to talk before the hearing," she said. "It's in everyone's best interest." She didn't say what she wanted, and I didn't return the call. On Monday morning, Trina had news. The real estate office had confirmed Autumn's presence when the trust documents were notarized alone again. The witness listed on the form had since left the company, but the notary's log showed no signature from Bryce. "We're adding this to the pattern," Trina said. "It's exactly what we needed before the hearing." The stack of evidence was now more than paperwork. It was a record of each choice Autumn had made, each step she had taken to push me out. We were ready to show it, but the hearing was still days away. Until then, the best thing I could do was keep my distance, let the silence work, and wait for the next move. The call came early on a Friday afternoon. Trina's voice was clear and steady. "Bryce opened his eyes today," she said. No words yet, but the nurse said he looked straight at her when she said his name. I sat there holding the phone, the sound of her voice settling over me. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was movement. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the motel bed, the hum of the heater filling the quiet, thinking about what it might mean if he could recognize a voice. By morning, I was dressed and sitting in the lobby before the sun had burned through the clouds. I didn't plan to go inside the hospital. I knew the rules, but I wanted to be close. I bought a coffee I didn't drink and found a bench across from the ER entrance. The flow of people was steady: nurses with clipboards, patients leaving with discharge papers, visitors carrying flowers. At 9:12 a.m., I saw Autumn's SUV pull in. She stepped out alone, her gray suit crisp, her lipstick a deep red. Her stride was sharp, but as she passed the hedge, her eyes flicked up toward the ICU windows. She hesitated just for a moment before moving on. 2 hours later, Trina called again. "We got the bank footage," she said. "The timestamp lines up exactly with the notarized form. She's alone the entire time. This is the breach we needed." By late afternoon, we were at the courthouse filing an emergency motion. The hearing was set for the next day. The small courtroom was quiet when we entered. No jury, just the judge, Trina, and me. Autumn wasn't there, but her attorney was a man who looked like he'd been pulled from another meeting. Trina laid out the footage, the signatures, the dates. When the video showed the empty chair where Bryce should have been, the room went still. The judge granted a temporary freeze on all trust-related transactions, including the insurance payout and real estate assets. That night, the motel manager knocked on my door again. This time, he handed me a printed email. The trust would no longer cover my room. The payment had been stopped effective immediately. I packed in silence, moving my belongings into the small car Trina had arranged for me to use. She found me a short-term rental by evening, not much bigger than the motel room, but private with a door I could lock myself. The next morning, Trina called with another update. Autumn had tried to transfer full ownership of the house into her private trust, but the court freeze had blocked it mid-process. "The paperwork's incomplete," Trina said. "She's running out of room to maneuver." Later that week, I went to the hospital again. I waited outside until Autumn stepped out for water, then moved to the window. Bryce's head turned slowly, his eyes finding mine. There was no smile, no wave, but the look was deliberate. He knew me. That afternoon, Trina and I sat in her office going over the next steps. She asked me to list anything that had happened in the months before the accident that felt unusual, anything that suggested Autumn had been separating Bryce from me. I told her about the 2 weeks his phone had been missing, about the shared account we had agreed to keep that quietly disappeared, and about the birthday letter he had supposedly forgotten to send. Trina wrote each down without comment. Over the next several days, Autumn moved quickly. Trina confirmed she'd met with a real estate broker and had been seen leaving the same bank where the trust transfer had been attempted. We filed a motion to freeze her personal accounts, this time backed by the insurance investigator's preliminary report. The judge approved it immediately. That night, the phone rang again. This time, it was Bryce. His voice was faint, the words uneven, but it was his. "Mom," he said, and that was enough. We didn't speak long, but the call changed the air between us. The following day, Trina told me Bryce would be giving a deposition. "It won't be long," she said, "but it will confirm he didn't authorize any of this after the accident." I drove back to my rental and sat on the small balcony until the light faded. The wind moved through the trees, and for the first time in weeks, I felt still. When the deposition day came, Trina met me at the courthouse steps. Bryce had been clear in his statement. He remembered everything before the accident, and he had never signed the second trust amendment. That alone wouldn't close the case, but it put weight behind everything we'd gathered. Inside the hearing room, Autumn walked in, wearing a pale coat and oversized sunglasses. She glanced at me once, then looked away. Trina presented the timeline, the bank transfers, the footage, the medical records. There was no raised voice, no sudden drama, just each piece set down one after the other. By midday, Autumn's lawyer requested a recess. When we returned, the tone in the room had shifted. The judge asked if I wished to make a statement for the record. I stood, keeping my voice even, and said my name, my history with the house, and what had been taken from me without my consent. I ended by saying that silence was not consent. The judge nodded and closed the session for the day. Outside, Trina said, "She's losing ground." I could see it too, not in anything Autumn said, but in what she didn't. She hadn't expected Bryce to wake up. She hadn't expected me to keep pushing. The next move would be hers, but now we had the advantage. 2 days after the hearing, a padded envelope arrived at my rental with no return address. Inside was a small flash drive. I brought it straight to Trina, and she plugged it into her secure laptop. The only file was an audio recording a woman's voice unmistakably. Autumn's speaking to a man she didn't name. She talked about what to do if Bryce wakes up and talks, suggesting moving everything to an account in Nevada and dismissing me as the old woman who would eventually give up. Trina leaned back in her chair when it ended. "This is obstruction, and if we can trace that account, it could go federal." She saved a copy and added it to our evidence folder. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The weight of the recording filled the quiet. That evening, I visited Bryce at the hospital. He was sitting up, his face thinner, but his eyes steady. When I sat beside his bed, he reached out his hand, trembling slightly. "I didn't sign any of it," he said. "I told her to leave you in the house." My throat tightened, but I kept my voice calm. "I know." He went on to tell me that Autumn claimed I was staying at a spa and that he only learned the truth when a nurse slipped him a note. The next morning, Trina filed a motion for a full audit of every transaction made under the trust since Bryce's accident. The judge approved it without delay. That same afternoon, Trina got a call from a woman who claimed to have worked briefly as Autumn's personal assistant. She didn't want to appear in court but sent screenshots from a burner phone Autumn used. At the bottom of one list, was my name with the note, "Push her out now before he talks." Trina printed the screenshot and placed it in the file. "This," she said, "shows she wasn't just protecting assets. She was removing you entirely." I left her office with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. It wasn't joy, but it was clarity. Each piece of evidence was drawing the shape of what had really happened. At sunrise the following day, Trina called again. She tried to move $140,000 into a hidden account in Reno. The bank flagged it. "We've got a temporary hold, but I need your notarized statement today." By the afternoon, I was sitting in a quiet office signing the document while a paralegal stamped each page. Trina explained the next step, an emergency injunction that would force a hearing on all hidden trusts and insurance transfers. Once this goes through, she said, she won't have anywhere left to hide. Meanwhile, Bryce was recovering steadily. He had been moved out of the ICU and was starting to ask more questions. He wanted to know where I had been, what had happened to the house, and why Autumn never let me see him. I told him only what he needed to hear, for now, that decisions had been made without his approval, and that he had been kept in the dark. He listened quietly, and then said, "I feel like a year of my life is missing." The following week in court, Autumn arrived with a man I didn't recognize. Trina leaned toward me and whispered, "That's her financial advisor, the one tied to the Reno account." In her opening statement, Trina presented the evidence clearly. The unauthorized transfers totaling over $670,000, the newly opened accounts after the accident, and the affidavit from the original bank officer confirming the insurance payout was redirected without my consent or Bryce's. The compliance officer who had flagged the Reno transfer testified next. He explained the metadata, the digital signature from Autumn's device, and the attempted addition of a new beneficiary to the secondary trust. The signature used was mine, but it had been lifted from a scanned gym registration form from 2014. The judge allowed the evidence without hesitation. When we left the courthouse that day, Trina told me she expected Autumn's attorney to reach out with a settlement offer. I didn't need to think about it. "We don't settle," I said. "We finish." That evening I visited Bryce again. He was stronger now, sitting by the window with the light on his face. "I heard what came out in court," he said. I nodded. "Then you know." He looked down at his hands. "I'm sorry." I put my hand over his and said, "What matters is that we know the truth now, and we still have time to set it right." The next morning, an email from Autumn's legal team arrived in my inbox, an offer to return half the assets in exchange for ending the case and signing a non-disclosure agreement. I didn't reply. Instead, I slid the message into a folder marked for record and went back to the list of steps Trina and I had outlined. We were moving toward the final hearing now. The pieces were lined up, the forged documents, the recorded conversations, the banking evidence, and Bryce's testimony. The days ahead would be about putting it all together and letting the facts speak for themselves. The morning of the final hearing began without rush. I stood at the small sink in my rental brushing my hair while the light above the mirror hummed faintly. My reflection looked older than it had a month ago, not from years, but from everything that had surfaced. At 8 sharp, Trina pulled up outside. She wore her usual dark suit, but today her expression carried something steadier, the look of someone who knew we were ready. On the drive, she went over the plan one last time. We would present the full timeline, every forged signature, each transfer, the hidden accounts, and the conversations Autumn never meant us to hear. Our goal was not just to return what was taken, but to bar her from managing anything tied to Bryce again. I nodded as she spoke, my hands resting in my lap. The courthouse lobby was busier than usual, with attorneys moving between rooms and a few unfamiliar faces seated in the gallery. Autumn arrived alone, wearing a beige coat buttoned to the collar. She didn't look at me as she passed, her gaze fixed ahead. When the judge entered the room, quieted, Trina began with the timeline. She laid each piece down without pause. The insurance change form, the bank footage showing Autumn alone, the trust transfer filed with an expired power of attorney, the Reno account flagged for suspicious activity. The screenshots from the burner phone and the audio recording came next, followed by the affidavit from the bank officer who had processed the payout. When she finished, she called Bryce. He walked in slowly, a hospital aide bringing his IV stand behind him, but he stood on his own once he reached the front. His voice was low but clear. He said he never authorized the transfers, had no knowledge of the secondary trust, and that if he had signed anything, I would have been present. He glanced at me once before adding, "She wasn't." Autumn's attorney declined to call any witnesses. His statement was brief, that there had been confusion and miscommunication around the power of attorney, and that his client regretted any distress caused. The judge listened without interruption, her expression unchanged. We broke for an hour while she reviewed the evidence. I sat on a bench in the hallway with Trina holding a cup of coffee I didn't drink. "She's going to rule in our favor," Trina said. I didn't answer, letting the quiet fill the space between us. When we returned, the judge read her decision plainly. The forged trust was void. The original terms were reinstated. Autumn was barred from managing any of Bryce's financial or legal matters indefinitely. Restitution was ordered, and part of the case was referred to the district attorney for possible charges. Autumn gathered her papers without speaking and left the courtroom. I stayed seated until the room was nearly empty. Bryce made his way over and hugged me. It wasn't an apology, and it didn't need to be. It was acknowledgement in front of everyone that we had come through this side by side. That evening, Trina and I met at a small diner near the courthouse. She kept her laptop open, checking new court memos as they came in. "I'll stay on until the restitution is complete," she said. "We'll garnish her remaining assets if we have to." I agreed, knowing there was still work to finish, but also that the hardest part was behind us. When I unlocked my front door later that night, the house felt different still and familiar all at once. I didn't turn on all the lights, just the one in the corner, where I used to read to Bryce when he was a boy. I stood there for a long moment, letting the quiet settle. The next steps would take time, but the direction was clear. Autumn's reach had been cut off, and what was mine and Bryce's was back under our control. From here, we could decide what to do with it on our own terms. The first morning back in my own house, I moved slowly from room to room. Autumn hadn't changed much, but the small differences were clear. My chair missing from the sunroom, the pot rack gone from the kitchen, family photos replaced with framed quotes. I opened the hallway closet and began unpacking a single box, stacking folded quilts on the shelf. The air smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets I'd tucked in years ago. I decided to take it one step at a time. A box a day, nothing more. The locks were changed to my own set by noon, and I stopped at the garden store for perennials to plant in the front yard. The soil was still good. That felt like a start. While organizing the linen closet later that week, I found a folder shoved far behind a stack of unused towels. Inside were more forged documents, trust amendments, transfer forms, along with a small thumb drive. I brought them to Trina the next morning. She plugged it into her computer and scanned the files. She tried to move funds internationally, Trina said. The transfers never cleared, but it shows she was prepared to disappear if things didn't go her way. The weight of it settled in as I drove home. I had let her sit at my dinner table, trusting her to care for my son when I couldn't be there. Now I was sorting through proof of how far she'd gone to cut me out. A few days later, Bryce called. He was at the rehab facility now and asked if I could visit. When I arrived, he looked stronger, his posture straighter, his eyes clearer than I'd seen in months. We sat by the window, the winter light spilling across the floor. "I didn't know half of what was happening," he said. She kept me medicated, controlled everything. She told me you'd left on your own. I listened without interrupting until he finished. Then I said, "You're here now. That's what matters." He told me he'd spoken to his lawyer and would be filing for divorce without negotiation. Trina would oversee the division of assets and the medical trusts. "I'm making sure she can't touch my decisions again," he said. I nodded, knowing he needed to take ownership of that choice. Back at home that night, I took out an old notepad and made a new list. Not of chores, but of boundaries, what I would allow back into my life and what I wouldn't. Forgiveness wasn't on the list yet, but peace was. A formal letter from Autumn's attorney arrived later that week. She wouldn't appeal the restitution order and would comply with the court's terms. There was no apology, just her signature. I placed it in a drawer and left it there. That same afternoon, Miriam from the senior center called. They needed someone to manage the Friday meal program again. Their coordinator had stepped down unexpectedly. I said yes. On my first day back, Nancy, one of the regulars, hugged me without hesitation. "We missed you," she said. "Your casseroles were the only ones with flavor." We laughed, and it felt like something settling back into place. Driving home that evening with the windows down, the spring air moved through the car. The porch light flickered on as I pulled into the driveway. I stood there for a moment before going in, letting the sense of home settle in my chest. Bryce began calling every couple of days, just short check-ins, nothing heavy. He was staying with a friend while the final paperwork was completed. His voice sounded steadier each time. We didn't talk about Autumn. Some things needed time before they had words. At the senior center, I slipped easily back into the rhythm of Friday meals. The smell of roasted garlic, the sound of trays clanking against countertops, and the easy chatter of the women in the kitchen made the hours move quickly. It wasn't just about feeding people. It was about being part of something that felt grounded and real. One afternoon, while I was folding napkins, Miriam set a sealed envelope on the table. "Your name's on it," she said. Came through the shelter's mailbox. Inside was a cashier's check for $70,000 from a private escrow account. There was no note, but I didn't need one to know where it had come from. I placed it in the same drawer as the attorney's letter when I got home. I didn't rush to deposit it. This wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the fact that the line she had crossed had been pulled back where it belonged. The next Sunday, I stopped by the hospital where Bryce had started volunteering. He was guiding a man in a wheelchair toward the elevators, listening intently as the man spoke. I stayed back until he finished, then we walked together to a bench near the parking lot. "I'm thinking about night classes," he said. "Maybe social work or something close." I told him it sounded right for him. He nodded. I think I forgot who I was for a long time. We sat quietly after that, the late afternoon light stretching long across the pavement. A certified letter arrived a week later, the final accounting from the court. My accounts were restored, the forged authorizations struck down, and the house listed as mine without condition. The insurance company would release the remainder of the funds within the month. It was done. Not with a dramatic ending, but with a steady, complete one. The final court papers arrived quietly one afternoon, folded neatly in a plain envelope. They confirmed everything. The house was mine again. The insurance funds would be released, and Autumn had been legally barred from any involvement in Bryce's affairs. I sat at the kitchen table holding the documents, feeling a strange calm settle over me. It wasn't triumph or satisfaction, just the peaceful weight of things finally being right. In the weeks that followed, Bryce and I found a new rhythm. He hadn't moved back in yet, and I didn't push. We were learning how to be mother and son again, slowly, without rushing the parts that needed time. When he did come by, it was with quiet gestures, fixing the porch railing, bringing groceries, sitting together over a pot of coffee. Our conversations were simple, often unfinished, but full of an honest warmth that hadn't been there before. I spent mornings in the garden tending the perennials I'd planted. The earth was steady beneath my fingers, a reminder that growth doesn't happen all at once. Some things take seasons, pain, healing, trust. The house still felt different, but it was home again, not just a place, but a space where my dignity could stretch without apology. I returned to the senior center to lead the meal program, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms and the laughter of women who had known me long before any of this began. One afternoon, as I folded napkins, Miriam slid an envelope across the table. "This came for you," she said softly. Inside was a check, a portion of the restitution. It wasn't about the money, it was a symbol that the line had been drawn and respected. Bryce called regularly now, his voice steadier each time. We didn't talk about Autumn. Some wounds don't need words, just time and patience. He was planning night classes, looking toward a future shaped by his own choices. I learned something important through it all. Justice is not always loud or immediate. Sometimes it arrives quietly through papers filed and truths uncovered. It's found in the small moments, the turning of soil, the steadying of a hand, the rekindling of trust. If you've ever felt pushed aside by those you loved or fought to protect, know that your worth doesn't fade. Healing doesn't come with a timetable, and dignity has no expiration. You are seen. You are not alone. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. And when you can take a moment to hold on to your own strength, because it's enough.